This morning. Good. We just, as you probably know, we just finished a rather hectic couple of weeks. We spent a week in Sacramento. We were home for a day and then spent another week in Washington, D.C. So any faith that I may have built up in humanity before that has been dashed right up on the rocks. I'm still sorting through the dozens of pages of notes that I've taken the last couple of weeks. But I did want to share just a couple things with you this morning. First of all, at our Board of Directors, National Board of Directors meeting, 112, by the way, National Association of Realtors has been around that long. On Saturday morning, the vote was taken to increase dues this coming year by $40. That $40, at least 2/3 of it will be coming back to state and local use for political purposes. This is strictly a political fundraiser. It's in response to the Supreme Court's decision last year allowing corporations to spend money on political campaigns and issues campaigns. And the National Association of Realtors put together a task force to study that. And the determination was made that if we want to continue to be a player in the field, that we were going to need to step up our financial resources a bit. And so that's the reason for that. That is a 2-year extension right now. And will probably actually be around for 5 years because the goal is to raise $200 million, again, to fund political campaigns, to fund political issues campaigns. Which brings me to the reason really that we were back in D.C. last week. If you were in D.C. in the last couple of weeks, or in fact this week, you would have seen a full-page ad in the Washington Post, a number of the Capitol Hill papers, the Congressional Record, the Politico, and so forth. The headline is, will home ownership in America become out of reach? As our chief lobbyist told us the other day, we are in really the eye of a perfect storm right now. There have been challenges and threats to home ownership intermittently over the years. Right now we are really in the heart of some issues that are coming together in a very, very scary way. Any one of which could damage the housing market further. If 2 or 3 of these things happen to get through, it will change the face of the housing market as we know it in this country for the foreseeable future. And it will make housing virtually unaffordable for future generations. The first thing we're looking at in Washington, D.C. that we're fighting right now, and if you've heard me talk before, you know that housing has been under attack on a number of fronts, but in Washington, D.C., one of the big front burner items right now is mortgage interest deduction. And there is very real discussion going on Capitol Hill right now to eliminate the mortgage interest deduction on your primary home, on your second home, vacation home, on investment properties, or for homes over $1 million. Right now, it would appear that we may have won the battle, although there's been no vote taken. We are encouraging people to sign on to H.R. 25, which is the Protect the Mortgage Interest Deduction Act, which is currently working its way through Congress. But the indication is that we may have won the battle, at least on the primary residence for this go-around. Now, the reason they're attacking it, of course, is because, as we all know, Washington, D.C. is spending way more money than they bring in, and the mortgage interest deduction, they claim, voids about $125 billion a year in taxes that the government feels that they are entitled to. That's your money that they feel they're entitled to. So we may have dodged a bullet on the primary residence mortgage interest deduction battle this year. However, what they're doing is lining up right now against homes over $1 million or second residences. Why is that? Well, because obviously if you have a home that's worth over $1 million or you have a second residence, what are you? You're rich. And of course, what's the easiest battle to fight in this country right now? The class war against the rich. And so if you have one of those properties, you are undoubtedly rich. And so they will attack that full force this year and then wait a couple of years before they get back to attacking you on your primary interest deduction. So we are battling that very, very hard right now, making a lot of strides and headway and a lot of contacts back there. Because the concern is obviously not only does it decrease home values, it also takes away a lot of the incentive for people who have owned their homes for years. It would result in the greatest transfer of wealth that this country has seen from homeowners, primarily. If you own your own home and you would all of a sudden start getting taxed on that property where you have not been for the past 100 years. I think only Jerry's the only guy in here that's had a mortgage for 100 years, but some of the rest of you had a mortgage for a few years. Howie's had one for 70, 80 years himself. So, but it's a very real concern. And we're pointing out things, not just fighting against eliminating this, but pointing out the very real benefits to home ownership, which we enjoy in this country. That it makes a safer community, that it makes your children better educated. There's any number of things. For every 2 homes built, it creates a job. Every homeowner invests up to $60,000 or more in their community in terms of landscaping. They buy a car, they eat in the neighborhood. $60,000 is spent for every home that's built. So there are very real and tangible economic benefits to home ownership that are not being recognized in this. They're simply looking at it from an economic point of view. Here's the raw numbers. If we start collecting taxes on this, it's $125 billion to help us so we can continue to spend that money like drunken sailors, basically. So that's battle number 1. Battle number 2. As I talked before, the president has put out a white paper earlier this year, a 31-page white paper, which proposes the elimination of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's a very real concern. Why? Because that's second mortgage liquidity. The president is saying, well, that would revert to the private sector. Have you seen private sector banks step up in a big way lately?
No.
No. If you don't have a Fannie or Freddie Mac loan right now, you're not going to get a loan. Pure and simple. They do 60% of the loans, or they underwrite 60% of the loans in this country right now. FHA and VA do another 30%. So our federal government right now is backing about 90+% of loans in this country. And the president is saying, we just want to eliminate that. Why? Because over the last 4 years, disregarding the first 67 years of their history, they're looking at the last 4 years and going, well, geez, they've run up these massive debts and overhead and so forth, and we really need to do something about that. And we wholeheartedly agree. Fannie and Freddie need to be restructured. The way they're structured right now, the people who formerly owned before they were taken over by the government, the people that owned them made all the profit when times were good, but when things went south, who picked up the debt? We did. That's not a way to run a business. You can't have private profit but socialized loss. That just doesn't work. So we agree there needs to be some restructuring, but the problem is they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So they're taking somebody who's responsible for 60% of the liquidity in this country, the mortgage market liquidity, and saying we're simply going to eliminate that and hope that the private market steps up. What's wrong with that on another front is that, again, if the elimination of Fannie and Freddie is not bad enough, that also plays into something else. Now understand that when you're talking about the federal government, they don't necessarily talk to each other. So there's 4 or 5 areas that we're under attack on, and they're not talking to each other. So they really have no idea what the other hand is doing. So what the other hand is doing is in response to last year's Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, which A, doesn't reform Wall Street, and B, certainly doesn't protect the consumer, but it's a snappy name, and so they went ahead with it. The problem is that bill was about 2,300 pages. Nobody read it before it was signed into action, and they're just now starting to realize some of the stuff that's in there. One of the things that's in there, you've probably heard, is what's called a QRM, a qualified residential mortgage. And some of the debate going on about that right now is, well, if you have a qualified residential mortgage, this is in response to a lot of the bad loans that were written over the past 3 or 4 years. They did not have good underwriting standards in place. Wasn't a factor of the lenders or Fannie or Freddie, it's just that people were ignoring the laws that were already in place and the regulations and concerns that people had about them. So the overreaction or the knee-jerk reaction that we're seeing right now is this qualified residential mortgage, which says banks need to have some skin in the game. People were writing loans and they were selling those loans off and they were chopping them up and selling them off in tranches and so forth simply because they could. And they had no skin in the game, so they really weren't concerned if it was a good loan or a bad loan or if the people had any ability to repay it or not. So the knee-jerk reaction is saying, now we need banks to keep some skin in the game. So unless you write a qualified residential mortgage, you have to have 5% of that loan retained in your portfolio. Well, that's great for the big guys like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citi, and so forth, who are all for this. But if you happen to be a small lender, you're in trouble. You can't afford to keep a 5% of each loan in your portfolio, which means small lenders and a lot of consumer choice are automatically eliminated from the marketplace. That's a concern. What's even more of a concern is because the qualified residential mortgage says, in order to qualify, you have to have at least 20% down, you have to have FICO scores of 750 or 760 or higher, and there's a number of other regulations that are in place in order to qualify as a certified residential mortgage. How many of you meet those criteria today? Okay? That's what I'm thinking. Not a lot. It would literally eliminate millions of prospective, good, solid buyers from our marketplace today because they can't qualify. So they're going to fit into what the one of the head ladies from Wells Fargo told us they refer to. You know, if you go to a small bank, they talk to you as a customer, an individual, or a member of the community. If you go to one of the big banks, the number 3 lady at Wells Fargo, risk management director, says they're buy boxes. You're not a customer, you're a buy box. You either fit into a buy box or you don't fit into that other little box that you call home. It's very simple. So they're eliminating a lot of that from the market. The ability to go to a number of different lenders, the ability to have people compete for your loans, and it's problematic. So if the qualified residential mortgage portion goes through, right now, in order to qualify for a median price home in this country, which is $170,000, at the current savings rate of most Americans today, you would have to save for 14 years in order to get a 20% down payment for a home. It would be very, very difficult to do that for most people. And so again, you're looking at just moving the prospect of home ownership a little bit further down the road. The last thing there's a number of things we're concerned about, but the last thing that I'll talk about this morning is the loan limit. As you're probably aware, one of the reasons we got into problems out here and in a number of higher cost areas with exotic mortgages, with subprime loans, liar loans, all that kind of stuff that became so popular for a few years is because federally underwritten loans, Fannie and Freddie, were capped at $417,000. Now I may say $417,000, that's quite a bit of money. But you have to remember, it's only been about 4 or 5 years that the median price of a home in Temecula was $574,000. Murrieta was $576. Canyon Lake actually got up to $698 one month. Okay? So with a federally backed loan, it simply wasn't available in California, New York, Florida, a lot of the places in the country where people actually like to live. If you wanted to go to Missouri or Kansas or one of those places in middle America, yeah, you can buy a McMansion for $150,000. So they look at that 417 and they go, that's more money than anybody in their right mind would ever need. But it doesn't do much for us out here. And so it forced us into a situation where we had to rely on those exotic mortgages in order to get loans in place. So the problem is now, the government is looking at it and going, well, geez, nobody's using those upper limits anymore. Duh, you think? So what they want to do is reduce those loan limits back down to either 625 or potentially back down to 417. We're fighting that very hard because once again, as the market comes back, which it inevitably will at some point, unless some of these other things fall into place, we're going to be right back in the same situation before. We're going to have loan limits that are substantially under what our median market is locally. And in high-cost areas, Santa Barbara, actually a big chunks of California, New York, Florida, a lot of places will suffer from this. And once again, you're creating the very problems or the basics for the very problem that got us into the situation to begin with.